Our guests today are going to talk about something that everybody knows that is very important in my heart, and that is Cuba. In the 90s, Paula, and really Paula initiated, she had been with the Vencedemus Brigade, which told all their brigadistas, start organizing committees in solidarity with Cuba in your own city. And Paula brought in me and other people. And one of the people that came in and started working with the coalition in solidarity with Cuba was this guy named Mark Friedman, whom I would see after, at the end of the 90s, for some reason, the committee ended. Paula and I got tired of being the only ones showing up because of all the other things, Venezuela and everything else. And then one day I ran into Mark recently, and he said, we need to start the coalition in solidarity with Cuba in LA again. And he's done wonderful work bringing together a lot of young people. And I'm going to let him introduce, because I haven't met before, Cassio. So Mark, welcome and thank you for joining us. And Cassio, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Carol. Thank you, everybody, Michael, Steve, Anthony, and others, Dave, who were involved in helping to set this up. And we graciously thank you for the opportunity to update all of you. Some of you have been active. Some of you, like Michael, have been on our car caravans. As Carol Francis said, there was an unfortunate gap of about a dozen years when there no longer existed a Cuba Solidarity Committee, in part because of the death of John Hilson, who was probably one of the central organizers with Carol and Paula. Well, unfortunately, Carol Francis, excuse me. Well, fortunately, that has changed now. I became a teacher. I worked as a baggage handler at Northwest Airlines for the Machinists Union for about 17 years, carrying out political work there. Then transitioned to teach high school marine biology and science in inner city LA in Lenox and Inglewood, and developed a marine biology club. And as a result of that club, we were invited to attend multiple conferences in Cuba. The first was Mar Cuba, which was an international marine science conference, and I took a delegation of people from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, George Matsumoto, the director of education there, and close from the USC Wrigley Center, a number of teachers, etc. And then following that, another delegation of local teachers and people who were involved in environmental issues from Algalita and other groups. However, I think the most significant contingent that we took was in 2019 to an international environmental conference, where students that I had in school presented their research, education, and action campaign to deal with ocean plastic pollution. They presented in an international panel. We had a delegation of 21 people, the majority young Latinx youth from LA. Upon coming back, young people decided that they wanted to form a committee. And I am we'll find exactly to show you the initiation of that committee, if I can find it, maybe not. Sorry, I have so many screens open here. So a committee was initiated upon their return by some young Latinx, especially Brenda Lopez, who also works as a graphic designer at Random Lengths newspaper. So we began activities. The first one was an event for Pastors for Peace at the Machinists Union Hall that took place in Wilmington this past, July 26th. It was a very successful event. What I want to do is show one little video to start. But first, I'd like to introduce Cassio, who is a critical new member of our committee. And he can tell a little bit about his history, which is very unique and reflects what is happening within the Cuban American community. So, Cassio, it's all yours.
Hey everybody, I'm Cassio. Um, I'm a I'm a member of the committee. I've been doing like I guess video stuff for the committee, and then also just organizational stuff for the different events that we put on. Um, my own history is that I'm Cuban American on my dad's side. So my dad's family fled Cuba after the revolution. They were like the 1% in Cuba, and so they fled to Miami, basically, like lost all the property that they had. And since then, they're like extremely bitter towards Castro and towards Cuba. But my dad and I are like I was telling Mark yesterday, that they call us Fidel and Che at our family reunions, because we're the only ones who, you know, take, I would say, a supportive stance towards the revolution, but in general, just don't think that Cuba should be under any kind of blockade or sanction or embargo, regardless of how you feel about the revolution. So that's what we're trying to do with the committee, and add as much forces as possible to just put an end to this, inhumane 6-decade long, cruel punishment against the Cuban people for their own sovereignty. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So as Cassio mentioned, and I will show a video in a second, the focus of our committee is to end the blockade, period. And we want people to join regardless of other political views, regardless of whether or not they support the Cuban Revolution or not. Some people in the committee do, some don't. But that's irrelevant. The focus is on the blockade. This is especially important now when there is extreme division within the Cuban American community. Hitherto, for decades, we know that the Cuban American community, centered in Miami, but also New York and here in LA, was extremely right-wing and would not tolerate any discussion about normalized relations, about ending the blockade, etc. However, the new generation of young Cubans is different, and there has emerged a very important movement that has led the nation now in caravans of several hundred people, denouncing the Trump administration and now the Biden administration's refusal to end the blockade. And they are for opening up Cuba for travel, for trade, for remissions of money back and forth, which they cannot do now, to give money to their families. Given the closure of the U.S. embassy in Cuba to virtually non-staff, almost nothing, Cubans cannot get a visa. And also Cubans from the U.S. have a very hard time going to Cuba. So these caravans that began several months ago have now spread around the country, and they're happening this coming March 28th in LA and about 8 other cities. And this has become a focal point for committees such as ours to support the Cuban American community that is fighting to end the blockade. So this is a TV one, and then we'll jump to his. Here we go.
Today, dozens of cars participated in a car caravan from the federal building in West LA to Echo Park, demanding to normalize U.S. relations with Cuba. Organizers of today's protest, the LA Hands Off Cuba Committee, says they want to end any travel bans and sanctions, and they're calling on Governor Gavin Newsom and LA Mayor Eric Garcetti to invite Cuban doctors and nurses to help in the fight against COVID-19 here in California and in LA County.
We want to make it clear that Cuba has nurses and doctors that are willing to come to LA and California. Why not? We need the nurses.
The group argues that Cuba has successfully battled against Ebola, SARS, and other diseases, and that they are willing to come here to help.
So part of that was a decision to focus on, given what was happening here in LA, and we'll show some statistics in a second, what was happening with the crisis, the lack of nurses, and Governor Newsom's call for 3,000 nurses to come to LA, what they needed. And Cuba was willing, as Cuba has been sending brigades of international volunteers called the Henry Reeve Brigade to about 30 countries to help battle initially things like Ebola a number of years ago in Africa, and now for COVID and coronavirus. So this was a focus of some of the early caravans that we had.
I'm a member of the UTU, United Transportation Union, Local 54. I work on the railroad. Have a day off today, thank goodness.
This is the video that Cassio
San
did.
Pedro and Witness for Peace Southwest.
As Mike said, I just got back from Cuba. I'm blessed enough to be from the island, and so I went back. We all know that stuff is really hard right now on the island for a lot of people, and we know that the majority of the reason that it is that way is because of U.S. imperialism and the ongoing blockade.
Today's caravans are happening in Miami, Seattle, New York, LA, Ottawa, Montreal, Washington, and Minneapolis. So we probably have the best weather, but ready to roll?
When we get to the corner of Obama Boulevard and La Brea, and we're going to get out and we're going to leaflet the four corners, have our signs. It's a busy intersection.
Hands off Cuba! Hands off Cuba! Hands off Cuba! Hands off Cuba!
Cassio, why don't you talk a little bit about the efforts of the young people, some of whom you could tell us about them who were involved in the committee, and what you as young people are trying to do to rejuvenate the committee here in LA?
Yeah, so it's funny because when, excuse me, when Diana, who's one of our other young members, was telling me how the committee originally formed, she said it was because Mark's biology group got too political for the high school, so they had to move off campus, and then it converted into the U.S. Hands Off Cuba Committee, basically. But yeah, I mean, we're now, I would say like the majority of us are now young people in our committee, and we're, I guess, just trying to take it in a more, it's been really deeply in the socialist groups that are already existing in Los Angeles, and many of us are socialists, but we are trying to broaden the coalition so that we can take in all kinds of people. So we're meeting on Sunday to hash out a plan for how to like take the committee in a slightly more non-ideological direction to open it up to all kinds of people. And yeah, I don't know, Mark, what else do you think is
What are
important to
some of
touch
the
on now?
things that you all have done with the website, the book club, things like that, Instagram, Twitter, all the things that we older people know nothing about?
Right, so we're trying to build out on, we have our website, which is like posting articles that come out about Cuba. We're gonna launch a newsletter in the next couple of weeks. That'll be like a monthly newsletter that's just focused on developments of the blockade and embargo and ways for people to get involved with that struggle. We also have Twitter accounts, Facebook, Instagram at US Hands Off Cuba. And then we've been organizing book clubs. So the last one was about when Fidel and Malcolm X met each other in Harlem, and that experience. So we had like a great discussion about that. I think there was 28 people there, something like that. So it was a solid turnout. On March 22nd, we have another program that's about healthcare in the United States versus Cuba. It'll be a webinar, so look out for that. It's on our website if anyone's interested. And then on the 28th, we have another caravan. So I think, Mark, this is our fourth caravan now, right? In the last couple months or so. And yeah, the caravans have been growing in size and I would say in intensity also. And each one, there's more and more like excitement around the issue. So yeah, Mark, what else do you want to touch on?
I will just show this screen. So up there at the top is our next program. Dr. Bita Amani has been taking medical students to Cuba for a number of years. She is an epidemiologist from the Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science. And she, along with Dr. Stephen Asuna from Cal State Long Beach, who takes political science students to Cuba, will be having a conversation about healthcare, Cuba versus the US. This is going to be in 2 weeks, March 22nd, Monday night. You just need to go to our website, which I'll introduce you to, and link, and then you will get an invite from Brandon. Brandon Cabrera is our administrator. He's a former student of mine who is now an engineer, software engineer, no, a mechanical engineer, and has been doing a lot of work to expand our committee among young Latino engineers who he's worked with over the years. The mission statement is very clear about what we're about: ending the blockade, normalize relations, returning Guantanamo. I will also add that one of the things that we are doing, this, can people see this? This is a list of Congress people who have signed off on a proposed bill. There are 80 signers now to end the blockade of Cuba. And so this is going before Congress. We don't know at what pace. We do know, however, that the Biden administration has said there will be no action in the short term on ending the blockade of Cuba, which is very unfortunate given that was one of his promises.
Yeah.
And we will be continuing to push him on that, not only through this legislation, but through the expansion of the caravans. Let's stop there for a minute and see if there are any questions.
Can you go back to that page that you just had, because there was nothing on the page, and maybe you could scroll up.
Sorry. So can you see some of the highlighted names? Are they coming through? Okay.
Better.
Yeah, these are some of the more local representatives who have signed on to this congressional appeal to change the U.S. policy towards Cuba.
Thank you.
Sure. Here's a really cool thing that the Cubans put out as part of their campaign around coronavirus. The U.S. blockade has been so intense. Under the Trump administration, there have existed 240 sanctions. If something has 10% U.S. components, it is not allowed to be sent to Cuba or sold to Cuba. Dozens of agricultural companies have sent a letter to Biden saying, open up. We want to sell our materials to Cuba. When Cuba put in an order for ventilators about 6 months ago from a European firm for their use in Cuba, a U.S. company bought that ventilator company and then sabotaged that sale. When Alibaba had organized a shipload of goods donated from China to Cuba, PPEs, during the coronavirus, the U.S. sabotaged that and said they would not permit that. If that happened, there'd be no Alibaba trade with the United States at all. So this is how they use these sanctions to really hurt the Cuban people. And people have compared the current situation, such as that young woman, Nia, who spoke at the caravan, who just got back from Cuba, to the very hard times that existed in Cuba when the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba lost 85% of its trade. So ending these sanctions is critical. This is a really cool little video I want to share with you that Michael put in, and you can get out your dancing shoes.
Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren, pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus patas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta ahí, pero dime tú, ¿pa' qué tú inventas? Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí para cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. ¡Hey! Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
I think one of the most impressive things to me and young people who went to Cuba and came back, international solidarity of the Cuban people. As Fidel said many years ago, what little they have, they will share. And that has been their true internationalism. Whether it be sending doctors or educators to the most remote parts of the world. They had 3,000 doctors in Brazil, and then the government of Bolsonaro came in. Oops, sorry. Not as good on this. And expelled those 3,000 doctors. Expelled those doctors so that there we go. So that there was no medical care for tens of thousands of Brazilians. And we know what is happening now in Brazil with an extremely high infection and death rate next to Mexico and the US, with entire areas like Manaus, which is in the middle of the Amazon, devastated completely. Cuba has sent doctors to scores of countries to help out in fighting the coronavirus. And they have developed a number of their own vaccines, Soberania, and another one that are in phase 3 trials. They will be producing 100 million doses for the 11 million people in Cuba, and then for the Caribbean and other Latin American countries. Here is one of the statistics that I wanted to share with you. It is a flyer that we distribute when we go out on the caravan. So this was particularly relevant to a teacher's caravan that we participated in. There was about 100 cars where the teachers said, we will not go back without safe equipment and vaccinations, and the option of vaccinations, even if not everybody would want to get them. Unfortunately, there are some people who don't. But look at these statistics. For LA County, which is about the same size as Cuba, okay, population of about 11 million, they have had in Cuba, a nation of 11.3 million, they've had almost 60,000 infections and 365 deaths. In Cuba, there is one doctor for every 150 people. They check everybody's temperature in the entire country every 5 days. There has been an increase of about 60 deaths over the past month, which is a lot. And in part, that is because of the international travel that has opened up. That has been Cubans coming back from vacationing abroad to Spain and other places, other international travelers that are treated with tremendous care, totally free in Cuba. But they have been able to keep it so low. Compare that to LA County. 10 million people, 1.2 million infections, and 22,000 deaths. And it'll be 23,000 by the end of the month. What a difference there is given the attention to Cuban medical care. So part of this we used was a campaign to get doctors and nurses from Cuba. Cassio, I don't want to dominate this. Would you like to talk about any other aspect of your videos you're working on, or the caravans, or what youth are doing?
Well, I was going to say maybe we should take the questions.
Great idea. Okay.
And then we can respond to those.
Good.
Thank you for being here. The National Organization for Women has reactivated its Global Feminist Committee. One of our co-chairs, Jan Stroud, has been very active with the U.S. Women of Cuba collaboration and has traveled there herself on several different excursions. We're forming, or with the UN, going for a feminist agenda, which would include ending the sanctions against Cuba and also like closing Gitmo. So I was wondering, and I think Teresa also would love to have a copy of the representatives that are supporting this. I noticed locally here, Ted Lieu and some other good folks in California, but it would be good to have the complete list. If somehow you can get that to IC, that we can be able to get it. Therese wants it also. If I don't know, my eyes are not that good this morning with this little print on the chat.
Sorry. Yes, there's absolutely no problem. And in fact, you make a very good point about expanding an aspect of our committee, which we just haven't had the broadband numbers of people to do. And that is to work on a resolution in City Council and the AFL-CIO Central Labor Council here in LA. And we would really welcome individuals like yourself and others who would like to work on that with us. I know Maggie in our committee, Rachel Brunke from San Pedro, are anxious to do this. And there's tremendous potential. There have been resolutions passed in at least 14 cities: Chicago, New York, Minneapolis, Albany, Oakland, and other places against the blockade and for normalization. In addition, there have been some important ones passed in labor councils, like in Seattle and Troy, New York, calling for an end to the blockade. So yes, we are more than willing to help with that.
Mark, keep ICUJP informed about that through me or through the web, through the general list. We do lobbying, and would love to work with you on that to pass the bill and to lobby our local people about getting Cuban doctors here. Cuban doctors, of course, volunteered by the over 1,000 medical people when Katrina hit New Orleans, and were not allowed to come in.
Cassio and Mark, just terrific to have you here and to form a stronger partnership with you going forward. My wife and I had an extraordinary trip to Cuba in April of 2013. It was a period when it was ironic. The US government didn't want you to go there for tourism, so they insisted on meetings with community groups, schools, clinics. So we were purposely exposed to the strength of the Cuban culture and economy and the people, and it was an amazing trip. My question to both of you is kind of in two parts. We know that Barack Obama lifted the embargo or opened, I should say, relations in December of 2014. So we had a period in American history of about 2 years under the Obama administration, and in which there were improved relations with Cuba. Sometimes on a serious public policy question, you have to imagine what you are hoping for. You have to envision what success would look like. And so my first part of my question is if you could describe what relations were like between the United States and Cuba during that brief hiatus before Trump shut it down. And then the second part is closely related because Joe Biden was vice president during those years. And given his campaigning and promises, wouldn't it be the most natural thing as he is reversing Trump policies and reinstating pre-existing policies of the Obama administration, that he would make it a 100-day priority to lift the embargo with Cuba? So help us understand, as far as you know, what's behind his refusal to take action on that. And that's the second part of my question. Thank you.
I think Cassio is in a good position to answer that second part because he has something in the works for the Miami Herald.
Yeah, I think that it has to do with the political issue of the 140,000 Cuban Americans in Miami, because there's this, well, as far as why Biden won't make a move towards Cuba, there's this idea that all Cuban Americans are against Cuba, and that if you say anything good about Cuba, you'll definitely lose Florida, notwithstanding the fact that Biden lost Florida anyway. So I guess what we're trying to do is show that there are a lot of Cuban Americans outside of Florida and inside Florida. We have a committee there also who are 100% against the blockade and would vote for Biden if he were to end the blockade, not the other way around. As far as how it was during Obama's time, I actually visited Cuba during that time with my family. And that's when I realized that everything I'd been told about Cuba was a lie, because I talked to Cuban people and saw it for myself. And yeah, I mean, I think Mark told me last night there was like 600,000 people visiting Cuba during that period. So Americans really, you know, a lot of Americans went when it was possible. But yeah, I mean, the Biden thing, it makes complete sense that he would reverse what Trump had done on Cuba, but I think it's going to take more of a push to get him to actually just get to the Obama level, which wasn't even a full repeal of any of the laws, which is what we really need, is a full repeal of all the laws that keep up the embargo to this day. Mark, anything I missed?
Nope, that's good. And closing Guantanamo. I mean, that was a promise by Obama, by Biden, but nothing has happened. And apparently, articles in the New York Times quoting Biden people, there is no rush. So they are not pushing for it. They are concerned about Florida, but what they have begun to realize is the divisions in the Cuban American community. We have been fortunate that there have been in Miami a gentleman who has a very popular YouTube channel with thousands of followers. He goes by the name of El Protestón, and he was the initiator of these caravans. He was then joined by a gentleman by the name of Carlos Lasso, who did a bike trip from Seattle to New York in order to oppose the blockade. Carlos Lasso lives in Seattle, but is instrumental in helping to build the caravan and helping us also. At our January caravan, we had about a dozen Cuban Americans participate, which is very significant because LA has a history of right-wing Cuban activities. They used to be able to call out thousands. There was a very active Alpha 66, which was a Cuban terrorist group that blew up the Cuban plane that had the Olympic fencing team on it, etc. So big changes have happened here in LA. We have won to our committee also an organization called the International Society of Black Latinos, headed by Juanita Palacios Sims, who is an Afro-Cuban who takes delegations to Cuba as well. We've also been in Zoom calls with our colleagues in Mexico. In Mexico, there's been a strong historical movement in solidarity with Cuba. So going beyond the question of a blockade, which is the focus of our committee, in Mexico, it has been since the revolution of solidarity and trade and oil and things like that. And they have chapters in every state of Mexico. So we have had some activities with them and look forward to greater expansion. Our committee also is part of the National Network on Cuba, which is several dozen committees, and Cassio is helping to play a leadership role in that. The LA committee is somewhat unique because of the composition and the demographics and the age. And I don't mean to denigrate any of us in the older generation who have been involved in Cuba, ending the blockade of Cuba for years, but the new generation is what is critical, and ours is primarily young, Black, and Latino. And I want to introduce you to the fact that we will be taking another delegation to Cuba. Let me show this. We just received an invitation from the National Aquarium. So in 2019, we took a delegation upon which Brenda came back and helped form and lead this committee, now with Cassio and Brandon and Pacey, who's a young Black woman who's a FedEx worker, her sister who's an Amazon worker, etc., as well as a number of former students of mine who are in college here and other places. So we received a proposal from the National Aquarium, Cruz Maria sorry, forgot her last name, Cruz Maria Santos, and an invitation to participate in the next environmental conference, which will take place in Cuba this July 5th through 9th. And this is an area where I think that your organization can assist. We will be sending a delegation of hopefully at least 20. We will focus again on young people and political activists and environmentalists, talking about campaigns they've been involved in, whether it's ocean plastic pollution or other environmental issues. What I'm sharing with you is a proposal that we made to the North American director of ICAP, which is the International Solidarity Committee that organizes and maintains relations with committees around the country. And these are some ideas for our tour and how we make it affordable. The tour will cost for about 10 days, somewhere between $1,250 and $1,500 per young person. This includes round trip airfare from LA, all housing, all food, attending the convention, registration at the conference, visits in Cuba to schools and hospitals, the aquarium, The last delegation in 2019, we were hosted by the Aquarium as well as a group called the Jóvenes Ambientales Cubanos, which is the National Environmental Youth Group. And they will be hosting us again this year, having their representatives hang out with us, travel with us, etc. Going to the Museum of the Revolution, art museums, and things like that. We would like to visit ELAM, which we were able to do in one of our prior tours, which is the Latin American School of Medicine, where there are several thousand people, young people from around the world who come and study medicine absolutely free. They go through a 6-year program, and then they go back to their originating countries, take their medical boards, etc. There are about 70 of these young people from the US who have already graduated. A couple of them here in LA and San Diego have been active in our committee. Abraham Vela, who is a doctor out in the Pomona area, has been part of our committee, some of our original programs, part of the national programs. He is a Guatemalan American. And what they do as ambassadors on a medical level, as well as an opportunity for young people from the US to go study medicine, get their degree, that in this country would cost them $250,000 or more, and they get it for free. A couple of the people on our committee, like Joanna Cervantes, who went on the last delegation, is studying now biology to become a doctor, to go through the college program here and then go to ELAM. Another one is Kevin Zepeda, who also was part of our Marine Biology Club and plans on going on the next delegation. We will also be doing 1 day of volunteer labor in Cuba, either some local construction. Last time we did a beach cleanup with the environmental youth. We also want to meet with the UJC, the Federation of Cuban Women, Henry Reeve Brigade members, etc. Let me introduce you to our website. So this is our website, which Brandon, Cassio, Diana Cervantes, and others have been working on. Brenda. This was just a little partial photo of our meeting at the Machinist Union Hall. This is the special program that we're having. These are some of the car caravans that we've had. And Brenda, who's an artistic designer, does some terrific flyers for us. But it goes through a history. If you go through this, Brenda spoke at the International Cuba Conference in New York that was virtual last November. This was a picture of us in Cuba for the environmental conference and part of our delegation. And that is an article from Random Lengths newspaper, which has given us significant coverage, as has the LA Progressive and Michael Novik's website, etc. And so we're tremendously supportive of that. This will go through a number of the different things, articles that we post, which are expanding this. Okay, it'll have a clip from Nation magazine. There's a new clip of an interview with doctors from the Roswell Medical Center in New York State on their collaboration with Cuba on the vaccines. So we post these so it's easier for people to gain access. Walter Lippmann does a lot of this and gives us an opportunity to do that. I want to lastly, and then we could take a couple more questions. So we are in the process of putting together a fundraising letter, which perhaps your organization would be willing to share. So this is going to be our fundraising appeal. It'll go out in about a week after people receive their meager stimulus check, asking for, $5, $10, $25, whatever people can give that will go towards the $1,500 needed to send a young person to Cuba. There's also a conference planned in New York around the vote at the UN, which is June 23rd. And we want to send a couple of young people to that to be in the UN and to be participating in the protests outside. We know that in the past, virtually every country in the world, with the exception of two, usually the US and Israel, opposed the blockade, but the US vetoes that. So some of the people, we have a pretty good, impressive list of people who've signing this fundraising letter. Dr. Vela, Ruben Tapia, some of you may know, he's had us on multiple shows on Radio Bilingue. Also, James Lafferty from the National Lawyers Guild, people from Healthcare for All, Belly of the Beast, which does some phenomenal Cuba videos that are like 10 minutes long on all different subjects. Marisol Cruz, who's in our committee, former Latinx school board member who got a resolution passed the Latinx school board to end the blockade. Alicia Rivera, who is a central activist in the harbor area in protesting the conditions in the community with air quality from the refineries and from other pollution. Gabriela Hackett, who is anti-police brutality activist and an Amazon worker. Rachel Sene, who goes back decades, who's involved in the Cuban 5 defense, and has graciously given us about 100 DVDs. And these have been one of our activities, which have been outdoor Cuba movie showings, which we have done and will start again in April, Cuba videos. So let me shut up there for a minute. Cassio can add. We could take some questions.
I had a quick question about some recent developments in Cuba. I read that Cuba has ended the longstanding economic policy they had of two separate currencies to try to protect the internal economy of Cuba and the pay scale and so on from the impact of having to use tourism as one of the main sources of foreign currency. And I'm wondering if you could say something about that, how that's working out as they've gone to a single currency, if you know.
I cannot tell you what is happening in Cuba. I know to offset these switching currencies. So Cuba instituted, I believe in the early 90s, two forms of currency. And this was an attempt to offset the fact that those people who received funds from family in the US were in a much better position to buy things. So they opened up some stores where people could use these dollars and they could be converted to what's called a CUP and buy things there. The problem is inequalities that developed in Cuba by those who had access to funds from abroad. It was also a way that the US financed some of their counter-revolutionary activities in Cuba, where they used organizations and unfortunately sometimes at times churches in order to fund activities to bolster the opposition movement. And I'll come back to the recent developments about that in a second. So the Cubans have now merged the currency, but in order to make it easier then for those average Cuban, they have increased the payments for Social Security, for monthly stipends and things like that, so that it'd be easier to buy food, etc. Remember, very few people in Cuba pay anything for housing or rent anymore. I mean, that was resolved years ago, beginning in the revolution, when rent was reduced to 10% of your income. And after 20 years or less, or 10 years, you own the house outright. So that was it. So they don't have the problem with homelessness like you have in LA. When our delegation went there, in 2 weeks, we did not see a single homeless person or a single drunk person or a single drug addict on the street. This does not mean that they don't have some issues with drugs. They're dealing with it, but they deal with it as a human issue, as a medical issue. So in order to help bolster the economy, they merge these. Part of that is the impact. They do not have the influx of dollars. So remember, there are no cruise ships now allowed, which brought in like $1 million per ship in docking fees, in what tourists would spend there, etc. And the scores of shops that sold primarily items for tourists, restaurants, etc., have virtually closed. A lot of the paladares, which are these small restaurants that people set up in like their living rooms where there would be a couple of tables, a lot of those have been forced to close. However, the key thing is Cuba has maintained the basic social services. The ration book, they still exist. And this ration book is a positive thing because ever since it was instituted 60 years ago, it guarantees at extremely low prices, pennies, rice, cooking oil, chicken, milk, things like that to every single individual in Cuba. So whereas we might think of a ration book as something negative, it was a very positive thing that was instituted in Cuba in order to guarantee food for every single Cuban in the country. Lastly, and others might have other comments also on the merging of the currencies. There was a national Zoom on it that involved some Cuban economists and ambassador, etc. Several weeks ago, or probably a couple of months ago, some of the rightists instituted another provocation around the issue of alleged violation of artistic freedom in Cuba. And they staged a demonstration. They did this with the known complicity of the US. They received funds from the US to do this. And this was an effort to besmirch Cuba in the eyes of the world at a time when Cuba was, and still has, thousands of doctors participating in helping to fight the coronavirus. Cuba has always supported artistic and intellectual freedom. As Che said, within the revolution, everything; outside of the revolution, nothing. And so we have on our website a lead article by Prieto, who's the Minister of Culture. The Cubans immediately met with these people. You know, it was a few dozen people, had hours of meetings with them, discussions with them on what they thought was a violation of their free speech and culture, and have pretty much resolved it with artistic freedom and cultural freedom being maintained in Cuba. But it was a significant provocation at a time when, you know, Cuba was getting much more renowned publicity around the world, which it is now also. The US News and World Report, CNN just had a special report on Cuba vaccines. So the US is more and more isolated on a world scale, but that does not mean they will not continue harassment of Cuba, provocations, and the blockade.
I really agree that this U.S. Policy towards Cuba is really a criminal act. And I guess my question is that what is the UN position on many of this, you know, to end the embargo of Cuba? I guess that's my question.
I think anybody, Carol Francis, could answer that. Michael, after they or Cassio have spoken, I can add my 2 cents, but good question. What's the UN's position?
The UN's position is very interesting. I think it was during the 90s, like a long time ago, they brought a resolution for the UN to vote on about lifting the blockade, about condemning the US policy towards Cuba. At the time, they were like, on the first vote, and they've had it ever since, on the first vote, 3 countries voted against it: the US, Israel, and Romania. But all the others, I mean, it was, the split was between abstentions and yes votes. And gradually the abstentions went down as countries felt less and less scared of offending the US aid and losing US aid. Until now, I mean, it's been 3 or 4 or 2 countries voting against it and almost no abstentions, or just a handful of abstentions. So it's like just about every country in the world except the US and Israel and whoever needs aid from the US that year. I mean, it's just like nobody's in the whole world is telling the US, stop.
Yeah, and in Obama's last year, it was the first time the US abstained on the vote, which is good, but it's also absurd because the vote is for the United States to end the embargo. So that was our first time abstaining. And then, you know, Trump went back to voting against it for 4 years. But now there's a national committee that's formed to do an action in all 50 states leading up to the June 23rd vote, hoping that the Biden regime will pick up either with the abstention that Obama did or hopefully vote in favor of it. So, you know, we'll see.
Pressure needs to be maintained on the US government. That's the focus. I mean, the UN is all against the blockade. I want to share for 1 second this screen, which just shows an example. Do people see that now? This is one of the flyers that we distribute when we go out in English and Spanish, when we do the little street rallies in the caravan. But look at this figure. Through the decades of implementation, the blockade has caused estimated financial damage to Cuba of 822. Okay, that must be wrong. It's about $8 billion. We must have a little error in there. But all of these restrictions, the right to travel, a limit on what amount of aid you can send, Trump shut down the Western Union offices, 400 of them, the pressure on other countries to cut off trade with Cuba. Items with 10% US components may not be sold in Cuba. Any ship that docks in Cuba cannot dock in the US port for 6 months, etc. And then the ultimate thing was January 11th, right before the new administration came in, Secretary of State Pompeo announced that Washington had redesignated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, which means the imposition of new sanctions with no basis for that. That was just to make it harder for the new administration to do anything.
Thank you so much, Mark and Cassio, for really enlightening us. This has been very, very good. 4 years ago, exactly this month, some of my family members and I were able to go and visit Cuba for only about 5 or 6 days. My brother, we're from Costa Rica, so my brother has had business in Cuba with business partners for years. But the writing was on the wall and he said, you better go now because it's going to change dramatically. And in effect, they lost everything because of Trump's not embargo, but real worse than that, you know, sanctions. My question, although that was a wonderful visit and, you know, we were so blessed because we were hosted by all of his partners and, you know, his friends from churches and leaders in the churches as well as in the government. We had a really very good visit. As you may know, ICUJP has been hosting a Close Guantanamo Now demonstration every single January for a long time. My question is actually, and I don't know why, I never thought of this when we were planning our programs to get someone to speak virtually from Cuba, but what would Cuba do with Guantanamo, and how has that base impacted them directly? What do they want to see happen if Guantanamo was closed? I think it would really help us to actually think about a binational event next time. We had our first virtual closed Guantanamo this January, and it worked quite well. And so maybe now we could, you know, think about including someone or someone's from Cuba. So do you have any comments about the Guantanamo impact?
First, let me say that my ignorance, I apologize. We did not know about your virtual US out of Guantanamo event. We would have joined in completely. And I salute all of you for carrying that on for years. What would the Cubans like? Well, as you know, they get a check from the US for $800 every year and they never cash it, right? Because they don't believe that the US has any right to have this base there. There are really so few people there interned now illegally, right? Without any legal action, legal alternatives, etc. There have been some terrific Zoom calls and webinars with people who were interned there. And people can go to, there's a national site, it's called US-Cuba Normalization Conference. And that is a broad national coalition of National Network on Cuba, IFCO, Pastors for Peace, about 25 different committees around the country. Ours, the one in Miami, Albany, Boston, on and on and on, DC. And they have all of these in a phenomenal website. If the US does, or I should say when the US does close Guantanamo, which they are only keeping open now for political reasons, there's no other reason. I think there's less than 20 prisoners there. They could be easily, they should be released, but we know that's not going to happen for a while, but they could easily be transferred. If the US did not blow up that facility, you know, to destroy it so the Cuban people would not have building structures, medical facilities. I remember showing Michael Moore's Sicko to my students because I taught physioanatomy. So we would talk about healthcare, and his movie, if you have not seen it, watch it. It's called Sicko, and it compares healthcare in the US, France, Cuba, Canada, England. And he takes a group of survivors from 9/11 to go to Cuba to try and get medical care equal to what the prisoners in Guantanamo are getting. So he tries to take them to Guantanamo, and they aren't allowed to get off the boat, of course. So then they land some other place and they get free medical care in Cuba and get all different types of medications to take back to the States that they can't afford because they've been cut off, you know, by US healthcare. Anyway, it's a cool little movie. So if the US didn't blow it up, Cuba would turn it into possibly part of their biopharma efforts, which are phenomenal. It's a conglomeration of 22 enterprises that have been producing very important medicines. I'll give you an example of two of them. One is they have a medicine that prevents lung cancer. Do you know how many people, including my mother, who died from emphysema from lung cancer? How many people in the world scale? The other one is a medication that prevents the amputation of limbs from people who have severe diabetes. One of the end stages of diabetes is lack of circulation, and people have their legs cut off. 75,000 people have their legs amputated in the US every year. Cuba has a medication that prevents that. They have not amputated a single person's leg from diabetes in Cuba. So their biopharma is phenomenal, as also shown by their COVID vaccines. And we cannot share these with the people around the world. Some of them get around the world, but certainly not in the US.
Thank you very much. And also, we don't get to have tours from their musicians like Silvio Rodriguez. We need to have that. Okay, we have Phil, Joe, and Ruby waiting, so please make your questions quick.
This is very short, but I remember the phrase in reference to Cuba, and I think Nicaragua also, is the fear of a good example. That Cuba is showing the world that many things are possible. And I'm not talking about the revolution of years and years ago. I'm talking about sustaining itself under pressure and putting the social services first. And I think this highlights that the rest of the world, the United States included, what I call the morally underdeveloped world, is actually living on despair rather than hope, the energy of hope. So I wanted to bring up that fear of a good example as part of the reason for the persecution, and also something I mentioned in a previous meeting, and that is it's sort of a parallel to the usually a woman who escapes a domestic situation of domestic violence and oppression. The abuser will pursue and do all kinds of measures to try to, well, let's say, retaliate and recapture what is escaping to freedom. That's all, just those observations. And of course, of our speakers, I'd like to hear how they react to that. Thanks.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I look at it sort of like if we can lift the blockade, Cuba will provide the example for the rest of the world. It's just, we need to lift the blockade first. So that's why I'm trying to take well, the committee is trying to take a non-ideological position, because I personally feel that the best thing you could do for socialism or social services would be to just lift the blockade in Cuba and show people a functioning country right off the coast of the United States. So I agree with you 100%.
That's great. Ruby.
Yes, one of the things that I noticed, can you hear me? Did I unmute myself?
We can hear you,
we
yes.
hear you.
Okay. One of the things that I noticed when Joe Biden came in, one of the big things he said, he was working on closing Guantanamo Bay, because there was like less than 100 prisoners in there, and there were more people working. I think he said 500 or more. And also, I have a good friend who has a travel agency who's been traveling back and forth to Cuba and taking delegations. And I called her during this call, and she said, yeah, she still can. So, you know, I know it's not closed all the way, but I think I just want to hear how you're dealing with Joe Biden right now, one-to-one.
Cassio wants to add in. Well, I wish we could sit down with Biden for a couple of minutes. We will leave that to the congressional people and building our caravans that will then get more support from other Congress people and city councils and central labor councils. I know we're nearing the end, so I'd like to take 1 minute to just thank the ICU JP. I will ask Cassio to do a report to our next Zoom call, which has all the key activists on it. It's normally about 20 people, about this very important beginnings of collaboration that we have with you and would like to have with you on joint activities. We would love to endorse your efforts. We will make a proposal that we endorse your efforts around Guantanamo, and we'll stay in touch for other activities. We would also like you to consider participating in two things coming up. One is the March 22nd. And if you go to our website, register for that, which will be a terrific conversation with Bita Armani. The second is our next caravan. We do these safely. When we do go outside of our cars, we're 6 feet apart. We all have masks. We have a bullhorn. We have a little rally. Or you're welcome to stay in your car, which a number of people do. We decorate our cars. We go through either Latino community or the Black community or combinations of both of them for about an hour. And on the website, we will have information on that. Our assembly point will be MacArthur Park. and then we go from there. We would like to ask you to endorse our committee, and if a representative of the ICUJP, and I know we're all struggling for funds, would consider signing that list of impressive signers we already have for our fundraising letter, which will go out to about 400 people. And perhaps you would send that out to some of your friends. We are asking for very modest donations, $10, $25, you know, from the $1,400 checks or whatever people are getting back. So $10, $25 to end the blockade. And to somehow continue this collaboration, I would invite the ICUJP to have a representative on our Zoom calls for our committee, or multiple representatives if you want, to participate with the young people and others representing other organizations to decide upon our activities. For April, we will be having something on the literacy campaign. We're going to try going back to an outdoor film showing of the movie Maestra, and then have a conversation with that about their literacy efforts. So I will stop there if Cassio wants to add anything, but our committee is unique among all the Cuba defense committees campaigning.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you also. Thank you so much for having us and for having a great conversation about Cuba. You know, we're going to keep pushing until the blockade's done, even if it takes my whole life. So, but it won't. It'll be sooner than that.
Thank you. And I want to lift up Andres Gomez, who is a major reason that the Cuban American community of Miami and across the country is different from what it was when in 1959. And that is this man with death threats, just ignoring death threats and organizing the Miami community. I last saw Andres in Havana, and he didn't look any different than he had 10 years earlier. But great. And if you guys have connections with him, I'm trying to get through to him. So let me know. Thank you.
If you send me an email, I will refer you to the leaders of the Miami committee. He is part of what is called the Alianza, and but the U.S. Cuba committee in Miami is also now in coalition with Proteston and the 200 Cuban Americans there in doing bicycle and car caravans. So they have taken the national lead in helping to build a joint effort between Cuban Americans fighting the blockade and everybody else. I want to reemphasize in ending that our committee is against the blockade, and whatever individuals have in their own political perspectives in our committee, that's fine. But our focus is the blockade, ending the travel ban, etc. We are non-sectarian. We believe in free speech at all of our activities. We have an open mic at all the little mini rallies, and would love to have someone from the ICUJP be a permanent representative on our committee, on our Zooms, and for all of you to consider signing the fundraising letter and sending that out. Maybe if some of you are in other organizations or religious institutions, take initiative and try and finance one young person to go to Cuba, or one young person to go to the New York conference.